It was a chilly Friday evening, and the city lights shimmered like a million tiny diamonds against the dark, rain-soaked streets. Inside the bustling heart of New York, there stood one of the most exclusive restaurants in the city, La Belle Maison. Known for its exquisite French cuisine and five-star service, it was the kind of place where the wealthy dined, deals were made, and life-changing moments happened over candlelit tables and fine wine. On this particular evening, Jack Thompson approached the front doors of La Belle Maison. His clothes were worn, his shoes scuffed, and his weathered hands trembled slightly as he reached for the brass door handle. Jack, in his late 60s, had the rough, callous hands of a man who had worked hard his entire life. His white hair was slightly disheveled, his face lined with deep wrinkles that told 1,000 stories of hardship and resilience. As soon as he stepped inside, the atmosphere seemed to change. The soft classical music playing in the background, the gentle clinking of glasses, and the low murmur of conversations felt like a world apart from the noisy, crowded streets outside. Jack's eyes slowly adjusted to the warm, dim lighting as he took a step toward the maitre d's stand. The maitre d', a tall, impeccably dressed man with a crisp, white shirt and a thin black tie, noticed Jack almost immediately. His sharp eyes scanned the old man from head to toe, his lips tightening into a thin line, as if the mere presence of this humble figure had somehow tainted the pristine elegance of his domain. "Excuse me, sir," Jack said, his voice rough yet humble. "I'd like a table for one, please." The maitre d' hesitated for a moment, his polished manners clashing with his instinct to dismiss this unlikely patron. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking to the scuffed shoes and frayed collar on Jack's shirt. "I'm sorry, sir," he replied, forcing a tight smile, "but I'm afraid we have a strict dress code here. Our tables are reserved for those who meet a certain standard." Jack's eyes dropped to his own clothing. He knew he looked out of place. His jacket, a once sturdy coat, now had patches on the elbows, and his shirt was a little too loose, hanging from his thin frame like a forgotten curtain. But he smiled politely, refusing to let the maitre d's words cut him too deeply. "I understand," Jack said softly, "but I can pay for my meal. I'm not here to bother anyone. Just a quiet corner where I can enjoy a warm meal." The maitre d's polite mask began to crack. He glanced around, noticing a few heads turning in their direction, some guests already whispering and casting disapproving glances at the entrance. "Sir," he said, leaning in slightly, his voice dropping to a low, condescending tone, "perhaps a different establishment might be more appropriate for someone like you. This is not a soup kitchen." Jack felt the words hit him like a cold gust of wind, but he simply nodded, his pride keeping him from arguing. He turned slowly, his footsteps heavy, each step echoing the sharp sting of rejection. As he reached for the door, a young waitress passing by caught his eye. She paused, her tray balanced expertly on one hand, her eyes filled with a mix of sympathy and curiosity. For a brief moment, their gazes met, and Jack managed a small, grateful smile before stepping back into the cold night. Outside, the rain had started to fall again, each drop a bitter reminder of his isolation in a world that seemed to value appearances over character. Jack took a deep breath, the icy air filling his lungs as he pulled his coat tighter around his thin frame. The streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, casting long, lonely shadows as he walked slowly down the sidewalk, his mind replaying the maitre d's dismissive words over and over. Yet, even as the cold rain soaked through his worn coat, Jack's spirit remained unbroken. He had faced far worse in his life, challenges that had tested his soul and shaped him into the man he had become. He had built his life on hard work, perseverance, and kindness, values he still held close to his heart despite the harsh judgment he had just faced. Little did the maitre d' know, the humble, weathered man he had just turned away was not just any old wanderer looking for a warm meal. Jack Thompson was, in fact, the owner of La Belle Maison, the very restaurant that had just rejected him. He had come in disguise, seeking to understand how his staff treated those who appeared less fortunate. What he discovered that night would forever change the way he viewed his beloved business and the people he had trusted to run it. And so, Jack disappeared into the night, a silent observer in a city that had forgotten the value of compassion, preparing for a return that would leave everyone stunned. Call to action. If you enjoyed this inspiring story, don't forget to share, and subscribe for more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories like this one. As Jack stepped back onto the rain-soaked sidewalk, the chill of the evening air felt sharper against his skin. He pulled his worn coat tighter, its thin fabric doing little to shield him from the icy droplets. The street was alive with the chaotic hum of car horns, distant sirens, and hurried footsteps of passers-by, a stark contrast to the warm, elegant world he had just been cast out from. He paused for a moment beneath the awning of the restaurant, glancing back through the frosted glass. Inside, a well-dressed couple was being shown to a table by the same maitre d' who had just dismissed him. The maitre d's demeanor had completely transformed, his smile wide, his gesture smooth and welcoming. Jack watched as they were seated by a large window, a candle flickering between them as they laughed softly, clinking their crystal wine glasses together. Jack's breath fogged the glass as he sighed deeply, his reflection a ghostly outline against the glowing interior. He turned and began to walk, his footsteps splashing softly against the wet pavement. With each step, his mind replayed the harsh words he had just heard, the sting of judgment sharper than the cold wind cutting through his jacket. "This is not a soup kitchen." The phrase echoed in his head, each repetition a reminder of how quickly people judge based on appearances. Jack had seen this kind of treatment before. As a young man struggling to make ends meet, working 3 jobs just to keep a roof over his head and food on his family's table. He had sworn never to forget those days, never to lose the compassion that hardship had carved into his soul. As he crossed the street, a sudden burst of laughter caught his attention. He looked up to see a group of young professionals spilling out a nearby bar, their designer coats and polished shoes glistening under the streetlights. They brushed past him without a second glance, their eyes focused on their glowing phone screens or each other, oblivious to the world around them. Jack turned a corner and found himself in a small park, its iron benches slick with rain, the trees swaying gently in the wind. He paused, leaning against a cold, wet lamppost, and looked up at the darkened sky. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the rain wash over his tired face, each drop a bitter reminder of the world's harsh judgments. Little did the maitre d' know, the humble, weathered man he had just turned away was not just any old wanderer looking for a warm meal. Jack Thompson was, in fact, the owner of La Belle Maison, the very restaurant that had just ejected him. He had come in disguise, seeking to understand how his staff treated those who appeared less fortunate. What he discovered that night would forever change the way he viewed his beloved business and the people he had trusted to run it. And so, Jack disappeared into the night, a silent observer in a city that had forgotten the value of compassion, preparing for a return that would leave everyone stunned. Call to action: if you enjoyed this inspiring story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heartwarming and thought-provoking stories like this one. What the staff at La Belle Maison didn't know was that Jack was no ordinary patron. In fact, Jack Thompson was the very owner of this upscale restaurant chain. He had come dressed as a humble old man, not to embarrass his staff, but to truly understand how his employees treated their customers, particularly those who didn't fit the mold of the typical high-spending clientele. Jack had built his business on the principles of kindness, respect, and hard work. He believed in giving everyone a fair chance, in treating every customer with the same level of dignity, regardless of their appearance or background. This test wasn't just a whim. It was a critical part of his philosophy. As Jack walked away that evening, his heart was heavy, not just from the cold, but from the realization that somewhere along the line his message had been lost. He knew he had to take action, to confront the very people he had entrusted with his legacy and remind them of the values that had built his empire. Jack returned to his penthouse suite that night, his mind racing with thoughts of how to handle this betrayal of his core principles. He would not simply fire those who had failed his test. He would use this as a chance to reshape the culture of his entire business, to remind his staff that true success is measured not by profit alone, but by the respect and dignity with which every person is treated. As the soft glow of the morning sun filtered through the massive windows of his penthouse, Jack Thompson sat at his mahogany desk, fingers tapping gently against the polished surface. His eyes, tired from a restless night of contemplation, stared blankly at the framed photographs lining the shelves around him. Pictures of family gatherings, business milestones, and heartfelt moments that had once defined his journey to success. Jack was not just a wealthy man. He was a self-made entrepreneur, a visionary who had built his restaurant empire from nothing but grit, sweat, and an unyielding belief in treating others with kindness and respect. Yet, the previous night's encounter at his own restaurant, La Belle Maison, had shaken him to the core. The maitre d's dismissive, condescending treatment had struck a nerve, awakening memories of his humble beginnings and the countless sacrifices he had made to get here. For a moment, Jack closed his eyes, letting his mind drift back decades, to the days when it first arrived in New York, pockets nearly empty, heart full of dreams. He had scrubbed dishes, swept floors, and worked countless double shifts just to keep a roof over his head and his family fed. He had vowed back then never forget the struggles of the working class, the silent battles fought by those just trying to survive. And yet, here he was, the very owner of a thriving chain of high-end restaurants, now facing the painful reality that his own staff had become the kind of people he had once fought against. He had built his business on the principle that every guest, regardless of their appearance or status, deserved to be treated with dignity. Clearly, that message had been lost somewhere along the way. Determined to make things right, Jack reached for his phone and dialed the number of his executive assistant, Emily, a sharp, no-nonsense woman who had been with him for over a decade. "Emily," he said, his voice steady but tinged with resolve, "clear my schedule for today. I want to visit a few of our restaurants. I need to see firsthand how our staff is treating our customers." "Of course, Mr. Thompson," Emily replied, not questioning his sudden decision. She had seen the side of her boss before. The relentless, deeply principled man who never shied away from addressing hard truths. A few hours later, dressed once again in his humble disguise, a worn, threadbare jacket and scuffed shoes, Jack set out to visit his various restaurants across the city. He walked into each location unnoticed, blending in with the everyday crowd, his sharp eyes and keen ears taking in every interaction, every smile or lack thereof, every tone of voice used by his employees. At one location, a young server welcomed him with a warm smile, leading him to a cozy corner booth without a hint of judgment in her eyes. She took his order with genuine politeness, even suggesting a few budget-friendly dishes without any trace of condescension. Jack felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps not all had been lost. However, at another restaurant, the experience was starkly different. He was ignored at the hostess stand for nearly 10 minutes. His attempts to catch a server's attention met with cold, dismissive glances. When he was finally seated, his server's forced smile and hurried manner spoke volumes. He was seen as a nuisance, an unwelcome burden rather than a valued guest. As Jack continued his quiet tour of his empire, a clearer picture began to form. The problem was not isolated to a single location or a single employee. It was a deeper, systemic issue, one that reflected a gradual erosion of the core values he had once held so dear. That evening, Jack returned to his penthouse, his heart heavy but his mind sharp with purpose. He poured himself a glass of aged scotch, the amber liquid catching the soft glow of the city lights as he swirled it slowly. He knew what needed to be done. A complete overhaul of his company's culture, a return to the roots of respect and kindness that had defined his early days as a struggling entrepreneur. The following morning, Jack convened a meeting of his top executives. They gathered in the sleek, glass-walled boardroom high above the bustling streets below, their expressions curious but slightly nervous. They had heard the stories of Jack's sudden visits, the whispers of his disguised inspections. Jack stood at the head of the table, his tall frame casting a long shadow across the polished glass surface. He placed his hands firmly on the table, leaning in as he met the eyes of each of his executives in turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice calm yet powerful, "I built this company with a simple principle, that every guest, regardless of their wealth or appearance, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. Somewhere along the line, we have lost sight of that." A tense silence filled the room, the executives shifting uncomfortably in their leather chairs, exchanging wary glances. "Last night," Jack continued, his gaze unwavering, "I was turned away from my own restaurant, dismissed, judged, not because of who I am, but because of how I looked. I have visited several of our locations over the past 24 hours, and what I have seen has shaken me to my core." The room felt even quieter, the weight of his words settling heavily on every shoulder. "This stops today, Jack declared, his voice rising with determination. We will return to our roots. We will retrain our staff, not just in the technicalities of fine dining, but in the fundamental art of human decency. I want every customer, no matter their background, to feel welcomed in our restaurants. He paused, letting his words sink in, because at the end of the day, Jack concluded, his eyes bright with conviction, a successful business isn't just about profit. It's about people. As he left the boardroom, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had taken a first step in reclaiming the soul of his empire, a step that, he hoped, would echo through every restaurant, every interaction, and every life touched by his legacy. Jack Thompson leaned back in his leather chair, the soft creak of the worn armrests blending with the distant hum of the city below. It had been a whirlwind few days, confronting the uncomfortable truth about his own business, rediscovering the core values that had built his empire, and reigniting the passion that had driven him for decades. Yet, as he gazed out over the sprawling cityscape, Jack knew there was one more chapter to this story, a final, deeply personal act that he could not ignore. He reached for his phone and dialed the number of his executive assistant, Emily. She picked up on the second ring, her voice sharp and professional as always. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson. How can I assist you today?" Jack hesitated for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "Emily, I need you to schedule a private meeting with the maître d' at La Belle Maison. Today." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Emily had been with Jack long enough to understand the significance of such a request. She knew the story, the harsh dismissal, the quiet test of character, and the deep sense of betrayal that had followed. "Of course, Mr. Thompson," she replied, her tone cautious but supportive. "I'll arrange it right away." Jack ended the call and leaned back once more, his eyes drifting back to the skyline. He felt a knot of tension forming in his chest, a reminder of the difficult conversation that lay ahead. This was not just about reprimanding a wayward employee. It was about confronting his own failures as a leader, about bridging the gap between his ideals and the reality of his business. Later that afternoon, Jack found himself once again approaching the polished glass doors of La Belle Maison. This time, however, he wore his usual sharp, tailored suit, a subtle but significant reminder of who he truly was. As he entered the restaurant, the familiar, comforting scent of freshly baked bread and rich, savory sauces filled his senses, momentarily easing the tension in his shoulders. The maître d', the same impeccably dressed man who had turned him away just days before, stood at his post, his posture stiff, his expression carefully neutral. Jack watched as the man's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face as he realized who had just walked through the door. "Mr. Thompson," the maître d' stammered, his composure slipping for just a moment. "Welcome, sir. It's an honor to have you here." Jack gave a small, polite nod, his eyes never leaving the man's face. He could see the uncertainty, the thinly veiled anxiety that now clouded the maître d's usually confident demeanor. "Thank you," Jack replied, his voice calm but firm. "I'd like to speak with you. Privately." The maître d' swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing slightly as he gestured toward a quiet corner of the restaurant. They walked in silence, the soft clinking of glasses and hushed murmurs of conversation fading into the background as they reached the secluded booth. Jack slid into the leather seat, his hands clasped in front of him as he leaned forward, fixing the maître d' with a steady, unblinking gaze. "I'm sure you know why I'm here," Jack began, his voice measured but heavy with meaning. "I'm not here to humiliate you or to fire you on the spot. I'm here to talk, to understand." The maître d' opened his mouth to respond, but Jack held up a hand, his expression softening just enough to convey a hint of understanding. "I know the pressures you face," Jack continued, his tone less harsh now, more reflective. "The expectations, the constant demand for perfection, the unspoken rules about who deserves a seat at the table and who doesn't. But that night, you made a choice to judge, to dismiss, to look down on someone who you thought didn't belong." The maître d's face paled slightly, his hands clenching and unclenching nervously in his lap. He seemed to shrink under Jack's intense gaze, the weight of his mistake pressing down on him like a physical force. "I built this business," Jack said, his voice growing stronger, more resolute, "on the belief that every customer, every guest, Every person who walks through those doors deserves respect. Not just the wealthy, not just the well-dressed, but everyone. He paused, letting his words hang in the air for a long, uncomfortable moment. I'm not going to fire you, Jack said finally, his tone softening just a fraction. Instead, I want you to learn from this, to grow. I want you to become the kind of leader who doesn't just manage a restaurant, but who understands what it means to truly serve others. The maitre d' nodded slowly, his eyes downcast, a deep, genuine shame etched into the lines of his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but found that his voice had abandoned him, replaced by a heavy, aching remorse that words could never truly express. "Thank you," he whispered finally, his voice cracking slightly as he met Jack's eyes. "Thank you for giving me this chance. I promise I won't let you down." Jack leaned back, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his lips. He had come here seeking not just accountability, but redemption, not just for his employee, but for himself as well. As he stood to leave, Jack reached out, placing a firm, reassuring hand on the maitre d's shoulder. "Remember," he said, his voice warm but firm, "it's not just about the food we serve, but the respect we show. That's what truly defines us." With that, Jack turned and walked away, the tension in his shoulders finally easing as he stepped back out into the bustling, sunlit streets of New York City. He had reclaimed not just his business, but his purpose, a purpose rooted not in profit, but in the simple, timeless act of human kindness.